The Hard Shoulder on Newstalk.
With Nissan Subscribe and Drive. No deposit, no compromise, no fuss. Find out more at nissan.ie.
Will future generations even know what the great Dolly is talking about? The decline of the 9-to-5 model has been declining it has been underway, should I say, that decline for decades. But according to some experts, that process has sped up, and soon we're all going to be living in an always-on culture. Well, Sir Cary Cooper is a professor of organisational psychology and health at University of Manchester Business School, and Peter Cosgrove is the managing director of FutureWise. Gentlemen, you're both very welcome to the show. Cary, in terms of that always-on culture, is it the inevitable direction that we're all travelling?
Oh, absolutely. But by the way, it was happening pre-COVID anyway. Flexible working was beginning to come in, the long hours culture, doing your emails at night. You know, you might have worked 9 to 5 in an office, the majority of people, but what ended up happening was you were doing emails at night on your way to work, you know, at weekends. And so actually it was starting gradually, but I think what happened is the pandemic just accelerated everything. And now flexible working is big time now, or what everybody's calling the hybrid model. So those people that have to be at the coalface, that's a different matter. You know, if you're a doctor or a nurse in a hospital.
Yeah.
If you're a pace assembly line, we got to be there. You're a pilot. Come on. There's no flexible working there. But the majority of businesses in Ireland, the UK, and many Western European countries are service-based businesses. And we have the technology to work more flexibly, substantially from home and go into the office a couple of days a week. That is on the cards big time now, because guess what? Employers want that, because in Dublin, if you have 3 floors for employees, now you won't need 3 floors.
Yeah.
You might need 1, and so you can get rid of 2 floors. That'll save some money, because people will be coming in from time to time, maybe a couple days a week, maybe some 3.
Yeah.
You know, it depends on what their circumstance and their role is. So I think it's totally changed. There's no 9 to 5 anymore. It's gonna totally disappear.
Yeah, despite that, lots of those companies you're talking about, lots of businesses, like on paper, they still have core business hours, 9 to 5. Is that what's going to change? You know, we have, as you quite rightly point out, we have got used to answering emails or sending emails or answering the phone or texts or WhatsApps or whatever it happens to be related to work long after those hours, long after 5 o'clock. But the company still has core business hours. Are we going to see the abandonment of those core business hours? And companies are 24/7 entities?
I think so, because I'm president of the CIPD, which we have in Ireland, the UK, and a few other countries. And we've been asking employers, HR directors, and the rest of it. No, it's all going to change. It's going to be an interesting contract. It's going to be flexible work or hybrid working, and which means that HR will work with you and your line manager will work with you, figure out, given the nature of your role and what they need, you might say, well, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is come in a couple days a week. I don't know which days. Might be 3 days some week, maybe 1 day another week. And I think that's going to change, because that will mean, for example, there are advantages to that, not just to the employer, but the employee has been wanting flexible working where they could take it, you know, where they didn't have to be at the coalface. They've been wanting that for 10 years. We've been doing research for 10 years looking at this as an issue, but people were frightened pre-COVID of taking it because it would show lack of commitment. They thought their employer would think, if they said, would you mind, I'd like to work substantially from home, their employer would think they're not committed, and they didn't do it. But now the employer wants it. The employee wants it. Some employers, by the way, are old-fashioned. Some investment banks, for example, are saying you have to be in 5 days a week, which will mean for them they'll lose all the young millennials.
Yeah.
They won't want to work for them.
And Cary, is it ultimately as well the customer that wants it? I mean, you think of shops, you know, and it's not that long ago that lots of shops, almost every shop closed on a Sunday, and plenty of them closed on a Saturday too. They were 9 to 5 operations, and they've become Monday to Sunday operations because customers demanded it. Is it ultimately customers as well who demand the service industry to be a 24/7 gig?
I think it's both. You know, this work-life balance has always been a problem. You know, you go in Dublin, I mean, in Ireland generally, in the UK, and a number of countries in Western Europe, the hours have been penal. You know, it's the commute into work. It's, you know, the hours you spend there. It's not. By the way, I wish in the UK we actually had a 9 to 5. It was more like 8 to 8 or 8 to 7. It was never 9 to 5 the last 5 years. And then you have the commute added on, and then you get home and you start doing emails again. So they've been saying flexible working. Why do I have to commute in? I save money not commuting. I save time for the employer, perhaps 2 hours a day, where I can be doing work from here rather than doing it having to go in the office. But I do want to go in the office because I do have social needs. I make my friends. I need the team build. I need to develop new products and services, and so on. So It's probably the younger workers, by the way, who will want to go in more full-time, more 4 days a week. So.
I mentioned Peter Cosgrove, the Managing Director of FutureWise, who's with us as well. Peter, I mean, we're kind of using the always-on culture and flexi time interchangeably there, but they're different things, aren't they? Like always-on will terrify a lot of employees, this idea that they can never switch off. Flexi time, less so.
Yeah, and actually, interestingly, the word flexible was always a terrible word pre-COVID, because actually if you said you worked flexibly, people thought it meant you worked less hours, which actually, bizarrely, it just means you don't work the hours in 9 to 5. So people actually didn't like to say the word flexible because it felt like they were, only working part-time, and they were kind of unfortunately used interchangeably. But as you said, I would be slightly worried about how the deal employees are going to end up getting out of this. I think in the short term, people say it's great, I don't have to commute as much, I don't have to go in. But actually, there's a lot of things that people aren't really seeing around the burnout at work. The fact that, you talk to a lot of employees and they're working longer hours now, despite the fact that they've had all this time back in their day. And also, it's this fact that we need boundaries. And whether we like it or not, work provided those boundaries. We went in at a certain time, we came out at a certain time, whether that was 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatever it was. Now, not having those boundaries, I think as people, we find it much more difficult for us to manage this than we used to think we did, because you talk to people and they're working all the time, and because maybe they say, I went for a jog at 11 this morning, so I better put a few more hours in the evening, and they're not even really counting the hours they're putting in. And as you said, Kieran, as well, even when they're not working, their head is in work because they're constantly just checking for updates and emails and so forth. So I think the downside is, even though people are saying this is great, I think it's going to have a huge effect on kind of burnout when people are kind of, as you said, always on, and that's going to be a real challenge.
And we have this right to disconnect as well, this code that's been introduced in Ireland, Peter. How does that work with flexible hours? I mean, I can see how that works in combating the ever-increasing encroachment of technology into our lives in a 9 to 5 context. It allows people to switch off after 5 o'clock. But if people are not working between those hours and they're kind of working at different snippets right throughout the day, how do you exercise the right to disconnect?
Well, the interesting thing, Kieran, is the right to disconnect never really worked, because by its nature it's a policy, and it's not the policy that matters, it's the practice within the organisation. Because if you look at the reality of this, the moment you start telling your employer and showing them a policy or a framework that says you don't have to work, you're almost creating a battle. And if your colleagues or almost competitors in the workforce are working those hours, you're already putting yourself at a disadvantage. So that was even when it was back in the 9 to 5. But as you said, now it's pretty much impossible for an employer to know when you are working and when you're not, and when they can interrupt you. So it's going to be a lot easier for an employer to continue to interrupt you. So I think a lot of the onus here is going to be employees going to have these conversations with their bosses. They're also going to have to have a lot of conversation with themselves about how poor they're managing technology, whether it's notifications, whether it's email, and how good they are at actually disconnecting themselves. Because whether you like it or not, an employer is never going to really, let's see, the best employees will want a very rested, kind of, innovative worker, but a lot of employers aren't going to be overly concerned if you're doing a few extra hours every day or every week.
So, Carrie, how concerned are you then with some of the issues that Peter's raised about the deal ultimately that employees will get?
Kieran, I totally agree with Peter, by the way. What ended up happening as we worked remotely is people were working longer hours. You know why? They didn't structure their day. They didn't know how to structure it. And I think that's an issue. So one issue is you're going to have to be pretty well structured and figure out your day, make sure you have breaks, and do those kinds of things if you're going to work from home part of the time, or let's say substantially, because I think that's what's going to end up happening. But we have lots of downsides to it. So that's one. We're going to have to learn different things. Before we used to get in a box. We were in a box called a house. We took a car, a train, another box to get to another box called work, and then we came home. That was easy. Everybody knew what was to be expected. Now in the hybrid world, it's going to be more complicated. One issue is the issue of we're going to have to learn how to live that way, working from home, making sure we have a break, making sure we clock off at 5:30 or 6, because we did during the remote working during the pandemic in most countries. We had longer. People were working excessively long. Our second issue is we don't have the right kind of line manager. People get promoted. Your boss gets promoted on the basis of his technical skills, not his people skills. So the other issue we have is, do we have emotionally intelligent managers to be able to manage people, some who are going to be in the office and some who are going to work remotely and who are working more flexibly. So in the future, we're needing to promote and recruit people to managerial roles where there's parity between their technical skills and their people skills. And we don't promote them just on the basis of their technical skills.
So, Peter, I mean, while we're all experiencing this, and apologies for the buzzwords, but this paradigm shift in terms of how we work, is there just going to be a period of muddling through and making mistakes until things settle down?
I mean, the first thing is don't as an employer or an employee put out edicts that everybody's going to work 3 days or everybody's going to work 4 days, because the reality is for the next 6 months to 12 months, you're just going to have to pilot lots of things and see what works. And what works for one person is not going to be the same. The reality is, if you're new to an organization, you should be going in most days, because actually there's a whole idea of building networks, building relationships, which is very different if being in the same firm 10 years. But the one thing I would say to every employee out there, because I see this so much, I love working from home, I'm much more productive, I never want to go back into the office, I would be very careful about that. Firstly, you're not as productive as you think. You're productive around tasks, but there's lots of other things that are happening: networking, relationship building, leadership skills, mentoring, all these things that can't be counted as easily but are really, really important, especially the more senior you get in the organization. So the second thing I'd say is, this is kind of one area that has now been taken over by technology. We know employers will do everything they can to have technology doing the jobs of humans. We're pretty expensive. And the moment you're putting yourself in this 2D relationship where you're constantly on a video call as opposed to speaking to someone in real life, well, guess what? One of the challenges you have is you're giving up one of the key skills you've got, which is that human-to-human interaction. So we shouldn't be giving that up too quickly. Okay. So I would tell people, go back a little bit more than you think, especially at the start, if you can.
Peter Cosgrove, Managing Director of FutureWise, and Sir Cary Cooper, Professor of Organisational Psychology and Health at University of Manchester Business School. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining me here on The Hard Shoulder.